Hi, I'm Lisa Stark with Education Week, and I'm here with two Education Week reporters, Allison Klein and Catherine Gewirtz. And we are here to wrap up the day that we had today talking about ESSA. Education Week held a summit all afternoon. Many of you participated. We thank you to talk about the Every Student Succeeds education. Of course, that is the new federal law that puts a lot of responsibility back on the states, and it's the biggest change to education law in the United States probably in more than a decade. So we're going to sum up for you a little bit of the discussion today to see where it went and where we go from here. And Allison, I'm going to ask you, first of all, a lot of people who were writing in today and asking questions had a lot of questions about the Trump administration and whether this is going to make a big difference with ESSA. What do you think?
So I definitely think that all of the signals that we've gotten so far from the Trump administration are that they are going to embrace the idea of state and local flexibility, which has some civil rights advocates worried that they may not be as vigilant as the Obama administration was in looking out for the needs of historically disadvantaged groups of kids. And actually, I should also add that the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, was also considered very vigilant with those populations. And so that's the overall flavor that we're getting from them, but we're still waiting for so many details. So I did get a number of questions today that I just couldn't answer. I had to say, we think this or we're hearing that, but we just don't know for sure, and it's a lot of wait and see.
Right, and because we know the Trump administration delayed the regulations, right? They sort of set them aside for a little while. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes.
Put a hold on them, if you will.
Yes, we said press the snooze button or the pause button on the regulations, and this is going to get technical and a little wonky, but the regulations for accountability, which is one piece of the Every Student Succeeds Act. Now, they still went through with the regulations on testing, which is the regulations on assessment. So the Obama administration's regulations there will stand. But for now, accountability, which deals with all of those state plans, how they're going to measure school performance and turn around their lowest performing schools, those questions are still yet to be answered. We don't know how the Trump administration wants to proceed.
And let's talk about testing, because that's what you talked about today during the ESSA summit. What were some of the concerns about testing under the new regulation?
Right. Well, like Allison, I had a similar experience of there being a number of questions we couldn't answer yet. Even though the regulations on testing, as Allison said, are still in place, still a lot of questions. People were getting down in the weeds and figuring out exactly how it would apply to certain subgroups, and I couldn't answer all of that yet. But one concern that ran across the questions was real basic stuff. Do states still have to test every year? A lot of people still don't realize that requirement from No Child Left Behind persists under ESSA. They have to test every year in English language arts and math in 3 through 8 and once in high school. They also have to test in science. So all of that's still true.
And so I guess the question is, one of the concerns with No Child Left Behind was the focus on testing, right? And so is this less onerous even with all of that, or do we just not know yet?
I think it's not entirely clear. There are parts of the law that keep the same regimen on testing, as we just said, but there are parts of the law that open the door to more flexibility. So that is in there. What states will do with it, we don't know yet. We don't see a lot of states rushing to take advantage of the flexibilities. And some of those flexibilities are things like, instead of giving one big test at the end of the year, you can chunk it up across the year and add up the results and have that be your year-end test. That's new. You could also use a high school test that everyone recognizes, like SAT or ACT, instead of your state's mandatory high school test. So that would cut back on testing. If your state used to give the ACT and a high school test, you could give it instead. So there's ways of cutting back, and there's ways of doing new things with testing, like measuring performance in part with portfolios, presentations, like big displays of student work, or long projects, so that's different too.
So there is some flexibility, but it doesn't mean that students aren't going to be taking these mandated tests by any stretch of the imagination.
Right, they still have to take those.
Okay, and one thing I thought was interesting in one of the forums today, someone had mentioned that, as we've talked about, this gives a lot of power back to the states, right, to design their own systems. And apparently someone said it's like the dog who catches the car. What do I do with this now?
Yeah.
I mean, are the states up to doing this job, or is it going to be quite uneven? What do you think?
I think a lot of folks are expecting that ESSA implementation will look really different from state to state, and I think uneven is a good way to describe it. States really haven't recovered yet financially, most of them from the Great Recession. And state education agencies, have sort of historically lacked a lot of capacity and know-how. And the ESSA allows them to think really innovatively and outside the box, but I think many of them will kind of want to stick with what they've been doing and sort of stay the course. So some folks are worried that there just may not be a lot of change, even though there's a lot of change allowed, a lot of running room allowed.
I wonder if that will happen over time. I mean, they've got to get these plans in, right? And I don't know, do you think the deadlines are going to slip? Or do you think they're going to, do we have any idea if the deadlines are going to slip? Because the plans, the first deadline is what, April, is it?
April 3rd, and
Right.
the second deadline is September 18th. Trump's pick for Education Secretary, Betsy DeVos, whose confirmation is looking rockier and rockier, but most folks still expect that she will get confirmed, has said that she wants to stick to that timeline. Now, if she does not make it as Education Secretary and we have to sort of start all over again, it's easy to imagine that timeline slipping, or somebody else just not being as committed to keeping the timeline in place.
But I wonder, I guess, as, given the fact that they're having to sort of develop their own plans, and as you say, there's a lot of flexibility, both of you have said there's flexibility in the law, but it appears that they aren't necessarily embracing that flexibility yet. I wonder if that tends to happen over time with these new laws. I mean, right now they just have to get something in place.
Yeah. I think it's going to depend on, first of all, how strict the federal government ends up being on implementation on these plans. A lot of folks may look to amend their plans when they realize that there is a lot more breathing room there. And I think once they see other states trying out or doing certain things, they may want to adopt them themselves. So one state needs to go first and kind of figure out the technical know-how and work out the kinks, and then other states may, continue to move forward. What do you think, Catherine, on assessments? Do you think that's likely?
Yeah,
On assessment,
Yeah.
I think states' reluctance to jump ahead with innovative assessments isn't irrational. I mean, the truth of the
Right.
matter is that for each of these flexibilities, there are complications and there are downsides, and there are things that make measuring your academic standards with this certain test, for instance, difficult,
Okay.
even though it would reduce testing. So there's a downside to every kind of flexibility, and there's an innovative assessment pilot that lets states really cut loose and make their own local tests. But as Allison has pointed out in her writing, the requirements to stick with that pilot are they're major. And not every state is going to be up to dealing with all those requirements. So for every opportunity, there's a complication, and that may slow innovation down.
And on the assessment and accountability, how much of a thumb do you think the federal government is going to put on the scale? I mean, they do have to approve these plans, right? I mean, the states just can't do something, and the feds have to sign off on this to some extent?
Technically, I mean,
Well, that's the question, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
ESSA,
We don't know.
The big theme of ESSA is it really robs the education secretary of power.
Yes.
I mean, this law was really expressed anger and resentment at how much power previous ed secretary Arne Duncan had. So it clipped the ed secretary's wings, so whoever inherits this office, they don't have as much power. And the spirit of the law is that states should really be more in charge of these decisions. So we don't know what they're going to do with that and how much oversight the feds will see fit to exercise.
And clearly, as Allison has said, the Trump administration has made it clear they want the states to have a lot of the responsibility.
Yes, and I think that will be true no matter who ends up staffing their department. Even if Betsy DeVos makes it through, which again I think she probably will, and we don't know who's is going to be in many of the key positions, like Assistant Secretary of
Right.
Elementary and Secondary Education. I mean, positions that most folks haven't heard of, but who can have a big impact on federal policy. I would expect all of them to sort of be leaning in the direction of more deference to states.
But again, the accountability standards, right, and the testing, they do have to make sure that the federal government has to sign off on what the states are doing, as I understand.
The state's plans
Right.
that Allison talked about that are first due in April and then again in September, if that holds. Right, the feds have to approve those, but what does approve mean?
Yeah.
I mean, is it going to be,
Okay.
looks good, we're going to give it a check, or is it going to be really getting into the weeds? And there's a peer review process too, which is really wonky, that states have had to go through for many years on whether their tests are high quality and aligned to their standards.
Right.
That will continue, and we don't know what those peer reviewers will do, how closely that will hew to this states' rights kind of thing. So all of that is an open question.
Well, let me just wrap up by saying both of you noticed in your forums that there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unanswered questions. Would you expect that to be par for the course, given the fact that this is a new law, or not?
So I think that there would have been big questions if, just for a new law coming online anyway. I think if Obama was still president, same secretary, same president, there would be fewer unanswered questions. If it was the same party in charge who had just previously been in charge, fewer unanswered questions. I think the fact that we're having a big transition in a law, at the same time so much else is changing, that really adds to the uncertainty.
Do you have any sense on how that might play out in the classroom or in the states or the school districts? Does it leave them kind of a little bit on shaky ground or unsettled?
I think in states, maybe, like in state houses, they're certainly pouring over these ESSA plans. In terms of actual classrooms, I would expect no. I think they're waiting to see what will happen, but I don't think that we're necessarily seeing a lot of turmoil in classrooms. Catherine, would you?
Yeah, no, I don't think we are.
Okay.
I mean, I think the turmoil over the Common Core was profound, and I think just starting to ease somewhat, and places are either teaching the Common Core or they've revised it a bit. But, teachers have been around a long time, and they know not to get too excited or ruffled unless there's actually something that comes to their school that demands that they change. So I think they keep doing what they're doing until they absolutely need to do something else.
Okay, we're going to end on that because that's a perfect way to end. Thank you so much, Allison, Catherine. Thank you for joining us. And you can go online at edweek.org and you can look at the ESSA Summit we had today. It'll be up there for 6 months. You can look at all the comments and all the great information that came from the Education Week reporters. I'm Lisa Stark. Thanks for joining us.